Hi, welcome back to the Coordinator series. Now, in this series, we are planning to create an employee management system. And in the previous video, I have already shown you the course contents. Now, in this video, we will do the following things. The first thing is basically setting up our the Coordinator framework, and the second thing will be this the setting up our GitHub repository. So all this code will be available to the GitHub repository, and I will show you how you can create your GitHub repositories and make it public or private depending upon your own need. All right. So the first question comes to our mind is that in the Laravel framework we are running the command like php artisan serve, which generates the URL for us, and through that URL we will be able to see our project in the browser. Now, how can we see the Laravel the coordinator project in the web browser? So it's pretty simple, like any other framework or any other HTML project that you are working. You just type in the localhost and forward slash your the directory name or the project name. So in our case it was EMS, and I just created it here. So I just gave this URL and the coordinator is up and running. All right, but there are a few other things that we need to configure before running the coordinator framework, and those things are really mandatory in order to run the coordinator framework and to access its full functionality. If you don't do that, we might occur with some we might face some errors in the coordinator framework. We will obviously face errors in coordinator framework. All right, so the first of all, I need to set up my database. So I have created the EMS database in my localhost phpMyAdmin, and the next thing that I need to do is basically let's first talk about the directory structure. Now, the directory structure is pretty simple. You do not need to touch this system file. This system file is basically not for any one of us. We do not need to touch it. The file that we need to work on is the application. So if we open this application, we can see a bunch of directories here. So we only need to work few with them. Okay, so the first of all is you can see the cache, the config, the controllers. So inside the config, we have the autoload, we have the config, constants, database, and doc type. So we will be working with the autoload, config, constants, and database. All right. And the next directory we will have is the controller. So all our controllers will reside in this directory. Then we need to work with, I think, if we use any kind of third-party library in our coordinator framework or in our project, then we will be using this libraries folder. But in this project, we will not be using any third-party libraries, so we will just ignore this directory. And the next will be the models and the views. So views, all our views will resist inside this views directory, and all our controllers will goes to the controllers directory and config. So this config file will basically we will be using only once. We will not touch it every time, just to configure our framework, and everything will be good to go. All right, so as I have already mentioned that I have created this database called EMS. So where do I need to give these credentials into my coordinator framework? So for that, I will come into the config directory and will open the database.php. Now inside the database.php, firstly, I will remove this line of comments because I really don't need them. And there are three major things that we need to focus on. The first thing is basically the database, the password, and the username. Now the DNS is basically if you want to use any PDO extension, you can set up it here. And the coordinator by default uses the MySQLi directory, MySQLi the driver for the database. Now, inside the username, if we are inside the local host, it will be most probably it will be the root username, because if you have not set up your directory structures, it will only be just the root, and the password will just go empty, and the database will be EMS. Now, the next thing I will need to do is basically the DB prefix. So I will just give this the project, the database name, and the underscore. And if I just come back, and everything works fine. Now, there are few other things that we need to configure before actually interacting with database. So what do we need to do? First of all, if we come to into this config file, this one. So the first thing that we also need to set up is basically the base URL. We need to define to tell our application that this is the base URL that you should focus on, and if we implement any kind of the HTML files, the CSS files or the JavaScript files, so you should always consider the following URL, and you should always look inside this domain only. If you so that in that case, if we give this the localhost /ems, and we type in and we give implement any kind of CSS or HTML files link inside our HTML directory, inside our HTML files or PHP files, this the framework will only look into this directory. If you do not specify it, you might face some errors. All right, so the next thing is basically remove this index.php, and we don't want this index.php to come into our the web URL. So if we do not remove this, by default it will be like this, the index.php. So we don't want this. The next thing that we also need to configure is basically the autoload. So in autoload we need to configure a lot of things. Everything is given inside the documentation of the coordinator. You can look into that, but there are a few things that I will show you out of the box here. Like, first of all, we need to set up our libraries, the coordinator libraries. We are not using any third-party libraries, it's just the coordinator libraries. And the second thing we also need to implement is the helper functions. So these helper functions will be the generic coordinator helper functions. So these helper functions are almost like facades that we were using inside the Laravel framework. So let me just copy and paste those libraries and helper functions, and I will go through the step by step with each one. All right, so I have another project open here, and where I have already set up some of the libraries and the helper functions. So I will just copy this thing and I will paste it here for the libraries, and for the helper functions I will just copy this one and place it inside the helper function. All right, so let's get to these libraries first of all. So image underscore library is basically the PHP extension library if you want to play with images. The database library is pretty important. If you want to interact with the database, you must need to have the database in your library section. If you do not implement this, if you do not load this library inside your database, the website or the web application that you are developing will never work. The sessions that will help over creating the sessions for users. Form validations, it's pretty simple. By the naming convention is that we will load the form validation classes, then the email class, and then the pagination. So in our case we do not need the email class, so we will just remove this thing from here. And let's come to the helpers. URL helper, we will need to load it. The form helper, the file, if we want to upload the file, so in our case we do not need it. Security, now this security will basically prevent, will do a lot of things, like will help you encrypting your URLs. There is another library that you want. If you want, you can implement it with inside this, which is the encryption library. We need to load this as well here. So with encryption library you can implement encrypt any kind of URL. The security will basically do things like XSS clean, like the cross scripting, malicious softwares, malicious codes or malicious HTMLs. And then the email, if you want to send any kind of emails, the cookies, the mail, and the journal. These are basically two custom helper functions which I will create in a moment. So just let me just remove this mail because we do not need the mail and the email. So I will remove both of them, and this journal helper. Now if I come back to this directory and if I reload it, so it says the encryption helper and the journal helper. So encryption is basically the library. We need to load it inside this here. We do not need to load inside our helpers. So I will just remove it right now for now, and I will just come back and reload it. It will say the journal helper does not exist. Now take a look at this. It is looking inside the helpers function. Now where this helpers direct, sorry, inside the helpers directory. So where this helpers directory exists. So it is, if we come back to our application, it is inside here. Now whatever you want to load, the helpers functions, the general helpers or any kind of helpers, you just need to name it with this. Like I will say the general, let me just create a new PHP file, general and underscore helper. So any name with the starting name could be anything, and underscore helper will, or the framework will automatically look for the files and will load it into the framework. So if I reload it and everything comes back. All right. So this is how we actually set up our coordinator framework. One more thing is very important, is basically the htaccess file. So I will just copy and paste the htaccess file from my existing folder, existing project. Now, in order to paste this htaccess file, you need to paste it first of all inside your main directory. Let me go to the main directory, XAMPP, htdocs, and ems. So first of all, I will place it here and then inside our application like this. And if I come back and reload the website, everything is working. Now, the next thing that we, all right, so first of all, we have covered two things, like how the directory structure works, what is the directory structure of this framework, and how to configure our the coordinator framework. Now, the next thing is basically we need to set up our GitHub repository, and I will show you in a moment like how we can set up the GitHub repository, and we'll push our code to the GitHub repository, and it will be public so you can download it anytime. All right, so let's go to github.com. Now I am into my GitHub repository, and to create a new repository, just click on this new one, and I will name it as EMS. And I will just mark it as either I can make it private or I can make it public. So I will leave it to the public so that it's accessible to everyone, and everything is good to go, and I will create the repository. Now here are the things that we need to do in order to push our code to the GitHub repository. So the first of all, I will need to create the git init command. So I will come, all right, so first of all let me close this second project that I have opened, and inside the terminal of my coordinator framework, I will just type in this git init, git add everything. Now the dot means everything, so everything in our project I want to add this into this GitHub repository. So it is just setting up the files, and git commit -m, which means a message. So I will say most probably I just say the date is currently 11th of June 2022. And the next thing I need to do is basically just set up the branch, which is basically the main branch. I will just paste it here, and then add the origin like this, and then push our code to the GitHub repository. And if I do this, it will automatically start pushing the code into the GitHub repository. So it's writing the objects, and in a moment it will be done. All right, so it's done, and if I come back and reload the page, and you can see the coordinator is here. Now you can see everything that we have set up. The htaccess file is here. If I open the application, and then the config, and then the autoload, so everything is basically here. You can see the libraries that we have included. All right, so this is the video. In this video we have talked about the coordinator directory structure, how to set up and configure the coordinator, and how to create the GitHub repository. So now this application is live and is publicly available to everyone. So in order to access this repository, you just need to type in github.com/Walid Ikhlaq, which is basically my name, and then the EMS, the repository that I have created. And you can just download it from here, and everything will be good to go. Now, in the next video, we will talk about, or we will be actually starting implementing our the admin template that I have already discussed in my first video. All right, so that was it in this video, and I will see you in the next video.